Welcome to Midnight Murmur. Here, the night comes alive with chilling tales and spine-tingling stories. If you crave the thrill of the unknown and the eerie whisper of the supernatural, you've found your new haunt. Join us as we dive into the darkest corners of the human mind, unraveling short horror stories that will keep you up at night. Hit that subscribe button, turn off the lights, and let the murmur begin. Whispers of the Willow House. Chapter 1. The Dare. The town of Willow Creek had always been small, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and secrets were hard to keep. Yet, there was one secret that loomed over the town, casting a long shadow: Willow House. The mansion, standing abandoned on the outskirts of town, was a relic of a bygone era, its grandeur now reduced to ruins. Children dared each other to go near it, but no one ever did, not really. The house was haunted, they said, and no one wanted to find out if the stories were true. Sarah was different. Ever since she was young, she had been fascinated by the supernatural. Ghost stories, horror movies, and urban legends were her bread and butter. So, when Halloween rolled around, it was no surprise that she wanted to explore Willow House. Her friends Jake, Megan, and Tom were less enthusiastic. They had heard the stories too, and none of them wanted to become the next chapter in Willow House's dark history. "Come on, guys," Sarah urged, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "It's just an old house. What's the worst that could happen?" Famous last words, Jake muttered, but he was smiling. Sarah had a way of making even the craziest ideas sound like fun. "Are we really doing this?" Megan asked, her voice trembling slightly. She was the most cautious of the group, always the voice of reason. "Yes, we are," Sarah said firmly. "We'll go in, look around, and be out before midnight. Easy." Tom shrugged. "I'm in. But if anything weird happens, we're leaving. Deal?" "Deal," Sarah agreed, grinning. She pulled out a map of the mansion she had found online. "Let's meet at my place at 7. We'll drive over together." As they left the diner where they had been hanging out, Sarah couldn't help but feel a thrill of anticipation. Tonight, they would uncover the secrets of Willow House. Chapter 2. The Haunted Reputation. The history of Willow House was as dark as the shadows that enveloped it. Built in the late 1800s by wealthy industrialist Thomas Willow, the mansion was intended to be a family home. But tragedy struck early. Thomas's wife, Margaret, died under mysterious circumstances, and soon after, Thomas himself vanished, leaving behind their young daughter, Emily. Emily grew up in the house, cared for by a succession of nannies and servants, all of whom left abruptly after brief tenures. The last recorded sighting of Emily was when she was 16. She too disappeared, and the house fell into disrepair. Over the years, there were countless rumors about the house. People claimed to see lights flickering in the windows, hear strange noises at night, and even see ghostly figures wandering the grounds. Some said the house was cursed. Others believed it was haunted by the spirits of the Willow family and the people who had died there. As Halloween approached, the stories intensified. The house became a local legend, a place to be avoided, especially after dark. When Sarah and her friends arrived at the mansion, they could feel the weight of its history pressing down on them. The house was a massive structure, its once grand facade now crumbling. Weeds and ivy climbed the walls, and the windows were like dark, hollow eyes. "Are we really doing this?" Megan asked again, clutching her flashlight. "We are," Sarah said, trying to sound confident. "Let's go." Chapter 3. First Impressions. Pushing open the front door, they were met with a gust of musty air that carried the scent of decay and mildew. The door creaked ominously as it swung open, revealing a large, dark foyer. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling like ghostly drapes. "This place is creepy as hell," Jake muttered, his voice echoing in the empty space. Sarah led the way, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. They moved cautiously, their footsteps stirring up clouds of dust. The walls were lined with old portraits, their eyes seeming to follow the intruders. The furniture was broken and covered in dust, evidence of years of neglect. They split up to explore different parts of the house. Jake and Tom headed to the kitchen, while Sarah and Megan went to check out the living room. The atmosphere was thick with tension, each creak of the floorboards making them jump. In the living room, they found a grand fireplace, its mantel covered in cobwebs. A large, ornate mirror hung above it, the glass so dirty that their reflections were barely visible. The room was filled with old, broken furniture and faded, moth-eaten curtains. "This place is a wreck," Megan said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, but it's kind of cool, don't you think?" Sarah replied, her excitement undimmed. She moved to a dusty old cabinet and began rummaging through it. "Maybe we'll find something interesting." As she said that, a sudden crash echoed from the kitchen, followed by a shout from Jake. "Guys, you need to see this." Chapter 4. The Living Room Discovery. Sarah and Megan rushed to the kitchen, their hearts pounding. They found Jake and Tom standing by the old, rusted stove, their faces pale. On the floor in front of them was a sofa, tipped on its side, its fabric stained with dark, dried blood. "What the hell happened here?" Megan whispered, her eyes wide with horror. "No idea," Jake said, his voice shaky. "But look at this." He pointed to the wall behind the stove, where more blood splatters were visible, old and faded, but unmistakable. "This is getting creepy," Tom said, his usual bravado gone. "Maybe we should leave." "No," Sarah said firmly. "We came here to explore, and that's what we're going to do." Reluctantly, the others agreed. They moved back to the living room, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over them. As they continued to search, Sarah noticed something strange about the fireplace. The bricks on one side were loose, as if they had been moved recently. "Guys, check this out," she called, her fingers prying at the loose bricks. With a little effort, she managed to pull them away, revealing a hidden compartment behind the fireplace. Inside was a small, leather-bound book, its cover worn and faded. Sarah opened the book carefully. It was a diary, and from the dates, it appeared to belong to Emily Willow. Her heart raced as she reads the first few entries, which described a lonely, unhappy childhood spent in the old mansion. But it was the later entries that caught her attention. They spoke of strange whispers that Emily heard at night, voices calling to her from the darkness. The last entry, dated the night before she disappeared, was particularly chilling. "The whispers are getting louder," Emily had written. "They call to me from the cellar. I must see what they want." Chapter 5. The Diary. As Sarah reads aloud from the diary, her friends gathered around, their faces pale in the dim light of their flashlights. Emily's words were filled with fear and confusion, describing the strange occurrences that plagued her final days. "The whispers started a few weeks ago," Sarah reads. "At first, they were faint, barely audible, but now they are constant. They come at night, filling my room with their eerie chant. I try to ignore them, but they grow louder every night. I can no longer sleep." "Poor girl," Megan said softly. "She must have been terrified." "There's more," Sarah continued. "She talks about seeing shadows moving in the corners of her eyes, feeling cold hands touch her in the darkness. And then this." Sarah's voice trembled as she reads the final entry. "The whispers are getting louder. They call to me from the cellar. I must see what they want. I am afraid, but I have no choice. I feel as though something is pulling me towards the cellar, and I cannot resist. Tonight, I will go down and confront whatever is there. If I do not return, let this diary be a record of what happened to me." A heavy silence fell over the group. The air seemed to grow colder, and the shadows around them deepened. "So she went down to the cellar and never came back," Tom said, breaking the silence. That's where we need to go." "Are you crazy?" Jake said, his voice rising. "Did you not hear what she wrote? The cellar is where the whispers come from. We should get out of here now." "No," Sarah said, her voice firm. "We need to find out what happened to Emily. We came here to explore, and that's what we're going to do." "She's right," Megan said, surprising everyone. "We can't leave now. We have to see this through." Reluctantly, Jake agreed. They made their way to the library, following the layout Sarah had memorized from the map. The library was dark and dusty, filled with old, rotting books. In the corner, hidden behind a bookshelf, they found the door to the cellar. Chapter 6: Descent into the Cellar. The door to the cellar was old and wooden, its surface covered in scratches and dark stains. It creaked loudly as they pushed it open, revealing a steep, narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air that wafted up was cold and damp, carrying the faint scent of mold and decay. "Are we really doing this?" Megan asked, her voice trembling. "We have to," Sarah said, trying to sound braver than she felt. She led the way, her flashlight illuminating the steps ahead. One by one, they descended into the depths of the house. The stairs creaked under their weight, and every sound seemed amplified in the oppressive silence. The further they went, the colder it became, until they were all shivering despite their jackets. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a small, dimly lit room. The cellar was just as dilapidated as the rest of the house. The walls were lined with old barrels and broken crates, and the floor was slick with moisture. In the center of the room was a stone well, its surface covered in a thin layer of grime. "Is this it?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It has to be," Sarah said, approaching the well. The whispers from Emily's diary seemed to echo in her mind, urging her forward. As she peered into the well, a sudden chill ran down her spine. The whispers were faint at first, just a soft murmur at the edge of her hearing. But as she leaned closer, they grew louder, filling her ears with a cacophony of voices. "Can you hear that?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Hear what?" Tom said, stepping closer. "The whispers," Sarah said. "They're coming from the well." The others strained to listen, but they heard nothing. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. She felt as though something was reaching out to her from the darkness. Without warning, a pale, ghostly hand shot out from the well and grabbed her wrist. The hand was cold and clammy, its grip like iron. Sarah screamed, trying to pull away, but the hand held fast. "Help me," she cried, panic rising in her voice. Jake and Tom rushed to her side, grabbing her arms and pulling with all their might. The hand's grip was unbelievably strong, but together they managed to break free. Sarah stumbled back, her wrist bruised and aching. The whispers ceased, and the cellar fell silent once more. They all stared at the well, their hearts racing. "What the hell was that?" Jake said, his voice shaking. "I don't know," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "But we need to get out of here." Chapter 7: The First Attack. Sarah's friends helped her up the stairs, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. The cellar door slammed shut behind them, and they could still feel the chill of the place clinging to their skin. Once back in the main part of the house, they took a moment to catch their breath and gather their thoughts. "We need to leave," Jake said, his voice firm. "This place is dangerous." Sarah nodded, still shaken from the encounter. "You're right. Let's get out of here." They made their way to the front door, only to find it wouldn't budge. They pushed and pulled, but it remained stubbornly shut. Panic began to set in as they tried the windows, only to find them similarly unyielding. "We're trapped," Megan said, her voice trembling. "We need to find another way out." Desperation set in as they searched the house for an exit. Every door they tried was locked, every window sealed shut. The whispers began again, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing moment. "Do you hear that?" Tom asked, his voice shaking. "The whispers," Sarah said, her eyes wide with fear. "They're getting louder." They gathered in the living room, their flashlights flickering as the air grew colder. Shadows seemed to move on their own, and the whispers surrounded them, filling the room with an eerie chant. Suddenly, Jake let out a scream. He was standing by the fireplace, his face contorted in pain. They rushed to his side, only to see deep, bloody scratches appearing on his arms and chest, as if invisible claws were raking his skin. "Help me," Jake cried, his voice filled with terror. They tried to pull him away, but it was as if an unseen force was holding him in place. Blood flowed freely from the wounds, soaking his shirt and pooling on the floor. "Let him go," Sarah screamed, her voice echoing through the room. With a final, agonized cry, Jake collapsed to the floor, the invisible attack ceasing as abruptly as it had begun. They gathered around him, trying to stem the flow of blood with their jackets. "Jake, are you okay?" Tom asked, his voice filled with concern. Jake nodded weakly, his face pale. "I don't know what happened. It felt like something was attacking me, but I couldn't see anything." "We need to get out of here," Megan said, her voice trembling. "We can't stay in this house." Chapter 8. The Escape Attempt. Determined to find a way out, they split up again, hoping to cover more ground. Tom and Megan went upstairs to search the bedrooms, while Sarah and Jake stayed on the ground floor. The whispers followed them wherever they went, growing louder and more insistent. Tom and Megan searched the bedrooms, finding nothing but more evidence of the house's dark history. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and the air was thick with a scent of decay. They tried every window, but each one was sealed shut, refusing to open. "This is hopeless," Megan said, tears streaming down her face. "We're never getting out of here." "Don't say that," Tom said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We have to keep trying." Meanwhile, Sarah and Jake were searching the dining room when they heard a loud crash from the hallway. They rushed out to find one of the mirrors had fallen from the wall, shattering into pieces. As they stared at the broken glass, the whispers grew louder, filling their ears with a deafening roar. "We have to find another way," Sarah said, her voice barely audible over the noise. They regrouped in the foyer, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. The house seemed to be closing in on them, the walls pressing in, the whispers growing louder and more insistent. "We need to find the source of the whispers," Sarah said, her voice firm. "Maybe if we stop them, we can find a way out." "Are you crazy?" Tom said, his voice rising. "We need to get out of here, not go deeper into the house." "We don't have a choice," Sarah said. "Every door is locked, every window sealed. We need to find out what's causing this and stop it." Reluctantly, they agreed. They made their way back to the cellar, the air growing colder with each step. The whispers were deafening now, filling their ears with a cacophony of voices. Chapter 9. Night Terrors. As they descended into the cellar once more, the air grew colder, and the darkness seemed to press in around them. The whispers were louder than ever, a constant, eerie chant that filled their ears. They huddled together, their flashlights flickering as they moved deeper into the gloom. They set up camp in the small room at the bottom of the stairs, deciding it was safer to stick together. They spread out their jackets on the damp floor, trying to make themselves as comfortable as possible. The whispers surrounded them, filling the room with a cacophony of voices. "I don't know if I can take much more of this," Megan said, her voice trembling. "It's like they're inside my head." "We have to stay strong," Sarah said, though she was shaking too. "We'll figure this out." As they tried to settle down for the night, each of them experienced terrifying visions and nightmares. Jake saw shadows moving in the corners of his eyes, ghostly figures that vanished when he tried to look at them directly. Megan felt cold hands touching her in the darkness, their grip like ice. Tom heard voices calling his name, growing louder and more insistent with each passing moment. Sarah's nightmare was the worst of all. She saw herself standing by the well, staring down into its depths. The whispers grew louder, filling her ears with a deafening roar. She felt a cold hand grab her wrist, pulling her down into the darkness. She screamed, struggling to break free, but the hand's grip was too strong. She woke with a start, her heart pounding in her chest. The others were awake too, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. The whispers had stopped, but the air was still thick with tension. "We can't stay here," Jake said, his voice trembling. "We need to find a way out." "We will," Sarah said, though she wasn't sure she believed it. "We just need to stay strong and stick together." Chapter 10. The Sacrifice. Morning light filtered through the small, grimy window in the cellar, offering a brief respite from the oppressive darkness. They gathered around the well, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. The whispers had subsided for now, but they knew it was only a matter of time before they returned. Sarah opened Emily's diary again, hoping to find some clue that would help them. As she flipped through the pages, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A new entry, written in fresh blood, had appeared on the last page. "It's a message," she said, her voice trembling. "From Emily." "What does it say?" Tom asked, his voice filled with dread. Sarah reads aloud, her voice shaking. "The spirits demand a sacrifice. Only through blood can the whispers be silenced. One must be given to the well, or all will perish." A heavy silence fell over the group. The air seemed to grow colder, and the shadows around them deepened. "Is this some kind of sick joke?" Jake said, his voice rising. "We're not sacrificing anyone." "We don't have a choice," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If we don't, the whispers will never stop. We'll never get out of here." "This is insane," Megan said, tears streaming down her face. "We can't do this." "We have to," Tom said, surprising everyone. "If it's the only way to stop the whispers, then we have no choice." "Tom, no," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," Tom said, his voice firm. "I'll do it. I'll be the sacrifice." Chapter 11. The Basement Horrors. The group made their way to the basement, hoping to find more clues or another way out. The basement was even darker and more oppressive than the cellar. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the walls were covered in strange, arcane symbols. As they moved deeper into the basement, they discovered a hidden room, its door concealed behind a large, rotting bookshelf. The room was filled with old, rusted torture devices and skeletal remains, a chilling testament to the house's dark history. "What is this place?" Megan whispered, her voice trembling. "It looks like a torture chamber," Jake said, his face pale. "Whoever lived here was into some seriously messed up stuff." Sarah moved to the center of the room, where a large, circular symbol was painted on the floor. It was a summoning circle, filled with strange, arcane symbols and dried blood. "This must be where they performed the rituals," Sarah said, her voice filled with dread. "This is where the whispers come from." As they explored the room, they found more evidence of the cult that had once used the house for dark rituals. Old, tattered books filled with incantations and summoning spells, strange artifacts, and more skeletal remains. "We need to get out of here," Megan said, her voice shaking. "This place is evil." "We can't leave yet," Sarah said, her voice firm. "We need to find a way to stop the whispers." Chapter 12. The Possession. As they continued to search the basement, Jake suddenly let out a scream. His eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed to the floor, convulsing violently. They rushed to his side, but there was nothing they could do. He was completely unresponsive, his body shaking and twitching. "Jake, wake up," Sarah cried, her voice filled with panic. Suddenly, Jake's body went still. His eyes snapped open, but they were different. They were dark and empty, filled with a malevolent force. "Jake," Tom said, his voice trembling. "Are you okay?" Jake didn't respond. He stood up slowly, his movements stiff and unnatural. He looked around the room, his eyes filled with a cold, dark fury. "We need to tie him up," Sarah said, her voice firm. "He's possessed." They managed to restrain Jake, tying him to an old, rusted chair in the corner of the room. He struggled and fought, but they held him down. "We need to find a way to get rid of the spirit," Megan said, her voice trembling. "We can't just leave him like this." "We'll figure it out," Sarah said, though she wasn't sure how. "We just need to keep him restrained for now." Chapter 13. The Summoning Circle. They returned to the summoning circle in the hidden room, hoping to find a way to banish the spirits and free Jake from his possession. The air was thick with tension, and the shadows around them seemed to move on their own. Sarah studied the symbols on the floor, trying to decipher their meaning. She flipped through one of the old, tattered books they had found, searching for the incantation that would banish the spirits. "I think I've found it," she said, her voice filled with hope. "There's a ritual we can perform to banish the spirits, but it's dangerous." "What do we need to do?" Tom asked, his voice firm. "We need to gather certain items from around the house," Sarah said. "Candles, salt, and a few other things. Then we need to perform the ritual in the summoning circle." "Let's do it," Megan said, her voice trembling. "We have to try." They split up to gather the necessary items, their flashlights flickering as they moved through the dark, oppressive house. The whispers followed them wherever they went, growing louder and more insistent. As they gathered the items, strange occurrences began to escalate. Shadows moved on their own, disembodied voices echoed through the halls, and blood seeped from the walls. Megan was injured by a flying piece of debris, her arm bleeding profusely. "We need to hurry," Sarah said, her voice filled with urgency. "The spirits are getting stronger." Chapter 14. The ritual begins. They gathered in the hidden room, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. They placed the items they had gathered in the summoning circle, lighting the candles and drawing a circle of salt around the perimeter. "Are you sure this will work?" Tom asked, his voice trembling. "I hope so," Sarah said, her voice firm. "We have to try." They began the ritual, chanting the ancient incantations from the book. The air grew colder, and the whispers grew louder, filling the room with a deafening roar. The shadows around them seemed to move and writhe, and the ground beneath their feet began to shake. The spirits fought back, causing physical harm and mental anguish. They felt cold hands grabbing at them, pulling them into the darkness. Blood flowed from invisible wounds, and their bodies were racked with pain. "Keep going," Sarah shouted, her voice barely audible over the noise. "We have to finish the ritual." Chapter 15. The Sacrifice. As they continued the ritual, they realized that a sacrifice was needed to complete it. The spirits demanded blood, and only through a sacrifice could they be appeased. Tom stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "I'll do it," he said, his voice firm. "I'll be the sacrifice." "No, Tom," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," Tom said. "This is the only way to stop the whispers. I'll do it." With a heavy heart, they prepared for the sacrifice. Tom stood in the center of the summoning circle, his eyes filled with determination. They chanted the final incantations, their voices trembling with fear and sorrow. The spirits responded, their whispers growing louder and more frenzied. The air grew colder, and the shadows around them seemed to close in. Tom's body began to convulse, blood flowing from invisible wounds. He let out a final, agonized scream before collapsing to the ground, his body lifeless. Chapter 16. The Ritual Completion. With the sacrifice completed, the whispers began to subside. The air grew warmer, and the shadows retreated. The house seemed to release a collective sigh, the oppressive darkness lifting. "We did it," Sarah said, her voice filled with relief and sorrow. "We stopped the whispers." They gathered around Tom's body, their hearts heavy with grief. They knew they had lost a friend, but his sacrifice had saved them all. "We need to get out of here," Megan said, her voice trembling. "We can't stay here any longer." They made their way back to the front door, hoping that it would finally open. To their relief, the door swung open easily, the sunlight streaming in and banishing the last of the darkness. Chapter 17: The Aftermath. As they stepped out into the daylight, they felt a sense of relief wash over them. The oppressive weight of the house was gone, and the whispers had ceased. But they knew they would never be the same. Sarah, Megan, and Jake made their way back to town, their faces pale and eyes filled with sorrow. They knew they had lost a friend, and the memory of Tom's sacrifice would haunt them forever. They tried to move on with their lives, but the events of that night stayed with them. They were plagued by nightmares and visions, and the memory of the whispers lingered in the back of their minds. "We need to tell someone," Megan said one day, her voice filled with determination. "We need to make sure no one else goes into that house." Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with resolve. "We will. We'll make sure everyone knows what happened." Chapter 18: The Investigation. They went to the police, telling them everything that had happened in the house. The police were skeptical at first, but the evidence they provided was too compelling to ignore. They launched an investigation, uncovering the dark history of the house and the cult that had once used it for their rituals. The house was sealed off, declared a danger to the public. The town was filled with whispers and rumors, but the truth of what had happened remained a closely guarded secret. Sarah, Megan, and Jake tried to move on with their lives, but the events of that night stayed with them. They knew they had done the right thing, but the memory of Tom's sacrifice would haunt them forever. Chapter 19: The Return. Years later, Sarah returned to Willow House, unable to shake the memories of that night. The house was in ruins, the walls crumbling and the roof caved in. But the air was still thick with the scent of decay, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. She stood at the edge of the property, her heart heavy with sorrow. She knew she could never forget what had happened, but she also knew she had to face her fears. As she stood there, she heard a faint whisper, a voice calling.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more chilling content.